everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
Let's talk some fantasy, friend Dylan. I am more than ready.
I gotta change the tone up a little bit.
Spice it up, keep things exciting. And what would be more exciting than the return of, I guess it's not really a series because this is the second time we've ever done this.
Yeah, and the other one's banked.
Well,
it's the
welcome episode we did this.
Oh.
But we have our recommendation series. This is something we're going to try and do more of now, but what it is we are going to find different categories, styles of fantasy books, and we're each going to recommend a book that we've read and liked and would, recommend that you read. And today's topic for our recommendation series is what standalone novel would we each recommend? This is not the definitive, this is the best standalone novel by any means, but these are standalone novels that we have read and that we would recommend you read. Well worth the time. And I think that's it. We'll just each pick we'll each pitch a book, and it'll just get us talking about more fantasy, and that's always the end game here. Friends talking fantasy.
We're in the end game now.
We are in the end game now. So who would like to go first? Do you feel strongly anyway? Direction?
I'll go first just to move it.
Let's do it.
I went with something a little bit different from, I think, most of what we cover here on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. I'm not sure, though they were pretty popular books, I'm not sure how many folks that listen to this will have, or not pretty popular books. This is Standalone. It was a pretty popular book called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. And I think it's a little bit more on the capital L literature side of things here, Charles, though it's definitely speculative fiction. I think that's just the crowd it ended up appealing to is a little bit more capital L literature from what I can gather.
I feel you.
Because I don't see it come up a lot on our fantasy or anything like that, but it certainly fits into this larger speculative fiction genre. And I'll just get started with explaining what it is. I grabbed some stuff from the Goodreads for this book, which is: one snowy night, a famous Hollywood actor slumps over and dies on stage during a production of King Lear. However, the world as we know it begins to dissolve, moving back and forth in time from the actor's early days as a film star to 15 years in the future, when a theater troupe known as the Traveling Symphony roams the wasteland of what remains. This suspenseful elegiac? Jeez, should have read this beforehand. Elegiac. See, that's that capital literature word right there.
Yeah.
Elegiac spellbinding novel charts the strange twists of fate that connect 5 people: the actor, the man who tried to save him, the actor's first wife, his oldest friend, and a young actress with the Traveling Symphony caught in the crosshairs of a dangerous self-proclaimed prophet. So that's from Goodreads. My explanation is basically it's this post-apocalyptic novel that, like they said there, goes back and forth in time to cover all these people who were interconnected in some way around this guy, Arthur Leander. That's that famous Hollywood actor who drops dead on stage right before the world starts to go to crap. And the way it ends up going awry is there is something called the Georgia flu, which wipes out 99% of the population.
Oh
Um,
boy.
it's obviously weird timing to be talking about this in the middle of a pandemic, but part of why I bring it up is because it's it's not really about the pandemic itself. Like it either takes place mostly before the pandemic or well after things have at least like no one's still sick from it. The only people still around are people who were immune to it. So the book is really it's interesting because you start talking about like dystopian or post-apocalyptic, Charles, and what comes to mind for you? What kind of books come to mind when I say that?
Um, that is a good question, Dylan. I'm not. What kind of books am I supposed to be thinking
You're
of?
supposed to think of the Hunger Games and things like that. Those bring about
Mm.
these like maybe not post-apocalyptic necessarily with that one, but like dystopian. I thought you might say that, Charles, but sorry to put you on the spot.
Like
Just wanted to
these.
get you more involved.
I appreciate that, but I guess like I don't know if I'd consider Hunger Games apocalyptic. It's definitely
Dystopian.
dystopian. Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
otherwise, you might think of things like The Handmaid's Tale is another one that maybe you would have said or something like that. That's pretty famous
I
now with
never
the
saw
show on
that. I never
Hulu.
read The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, I've read that one, and that's also like a little more capital literature type thing. But the the stuff that it evokes, I would say, is usually in tone very bleak, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think of those kind of books, and you're like, "Oh, this is going to be dreary," but and probably pretty epic oftentimes, like toppling governments if we're thinking things like Hunger Games, right?
Right, right.
So this book is very different from that. I wouldn't want people going and expecting that, and it's fresh because of how it differs from that. While it's post-apocalyptic and technically dystopian, the book is surprising, I think, in a tone that's like hopeful and then weirdly like slice of life in when it
Hmm.
hops back and forth into these people's lives. Like I said, it's not really about the pandemic or an apocalypse or anything like that. It is just about people, and really at its core, it tends to be about the just like what it means to be human. So we often think like I referenced in a recent episode that may or may not have been released at this point, the
Oh gosh, we.
friendship in Red Sister one. Um, I
That has just come out. That came out on Wednesday, and today's Friday.
cool. So you'll hear me talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in
Oh,
that.
we're coming back with the hierarchy of needs.
I'm bringing it back, Charles.
Exciting.
And though I won't explain in detail, it basically says you try to deal with your more base needs first, right? If you're ridiculously hungry, then you're going to be focused on that, maybe not other things. And when we deal with things like post-apocalyptic stuff, we think like these people are just trying to get by, they're hungry, maybe they're even like killing each other and all this
Like
kind of
Walking Dead,
stuff.
kind of. I
Walking
think
Dead,
also is a good
that's a
example
great
where they're like
example,
killing each
Charles.
other and like
Right.
barbaric almost. Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's all gone to crap. They're just trying to get
Yeah.
food and water and not die and all this kind of stuff. But in Station 11, though it's sort of this post apocalyptic feel, it follows a troupe that does Shakespeare plays. So they travel around and perform for people in the middle of this like dystopian setting. And on the lead caravan or lead wagon of this the caravans I go, the phrase survival is insufficient is inscribed on it.
Mhm.
And that happens to be a Star
Star
Trek
Trek.
quote that has gone beyond the apocalypse to stay alive. Like this does take place in our world. And I think as lovers of stories here on the FTF podcast
It's true.
and on the just people who love fantasy and stuff, we can appreciate the fact that this follows people that are trying to still tell stories and things like that, even amidst this like civilization has collapsed dystopian setting. And I just find that really, really like cool. And I feel like that's exactly the kind of stuff that would happen, right? Like we as people would not just fall into just all trying to kill each other and all that kind of stuff. I think we would try to preserve these things that are meaningful to us, like the arts. And
For sure.
I, yeah, I love that part of this. So it also, like I said, goes back to before civilization's collapse, and it focuses on this guy Arthur Leander and his life. And he's kind of this guy like he has three ex-wives. He is like in some ways kind of what you think of when you think of like a Hollywood actor who's past his prime, and you kind of look back on his life and you're like, what did this all amount to? And we get to explore what did this all amount to, because all of these people are in some way connected to him, and in one way or another he's influenced them, whether he realizes it or not. So he kind of just this guy who dies actually of a heart attack on stage, like when he's way past his prime, and then so he doesn't even like die of the disease that spread. But it just happens to be right when all of it starts happening, and it's like, okay, he doesn't really have much of a family or anything like that, and he dies, yes, in front of everyone, but also alone. And
Ooh, that's
yeah,
capital L literature right there.
that it is, Charles. It's pretty deep. So we get acquainted with him and all these other characters in this extremely like intimate way, where we get to know all their idiosyncrasies and their foibles, and they just feel really true in a way you don't often see in most of what I've read anyway. And it I think the stories in a lot of ways are about, hey, when we go in depth into this person's life and the people he's touched, you can see that we all impact folks in ways we often don't realize. And it's just a really cool tale about how that can take place.
Oh, that sounds kind of sweet, actually, for a book about a pandemic.
Yeah. Weird time. I know, Charles, you said, like, do you really want to talk about this right now?
I did text
Obviously,
him too soon, but it doesn't sound like it's that way. It's not
no.
about like getting us scared about how horrifying a pandemic could be. It's more about the characterization of how life moves on in a ways.
Exactly. It's much more about people's lives before and well after. It's not really going on too much during. It was weird timing for me. I did read it earlier this year. So in January of this year is when I read this. And then I I think it was more inspired by like the swine flu thing that never really came to pass in the way that things did with COVID, obviously. But it because it came out in like 2014, I think. But I read it in 2020,
Right.
and then I was like hearing about COVID and things like that. I was like, that's weird. I did just read that book, so it's weird, and I mean maybe not the best time for people to want to read it if that kind of stuff. Obviously, my heart goes out to everyone who's I mean, just the world in general for what we're dealing with, and also everyone who's been more personally affected by the pandemic. So maybe it's not great for folks if they're trying to get away from it, but it's also like hopeful in its tone in a way that I think might actually be not the worst for this time.
Got it. So this is the recommendation series. Could you maybe go a little more into like what kind of people or what kind of preferences you would recommend this book to?
Yeah, sure. I would recommend this book to people who tend to like more of a like slice of life type feel
Hmm.
to their books. I know I mentioned that earlier, where it's like I said, you're used to these if we're dealing with a dystopian setting or speculative fiction, oftentimes it's like let's destroy this awful government and the stakes are super high and all this kind of stuff. But this is more just like let's tell you about people's lives and how they're interconnected and how people affect each other. So I would recommend it to people who enjoy some of that slice of life or are looking for a change of pace from a lot of what we deal with, which is the world has to be in danger or the apocalypse has to be like something that we're trying to prevent or something like
Yeah.
that in fantasy novels. It's like, though the apocalypse already happened, how do people move on?
Yeah.
So
Very
I think
interesting.
those folks, people who are a fan of some of these, maybe what, fans of, I'll say, the Broken Earth trilogy actually might enjoy this because I think Broken Earth tends to feel a little more like capital L literature, very deep themes and things along those lines, while also like I mean, that book starts with the line like, what is it? It's like, let's start with the end of the world, like get it out of the way and move on to more interesting things. Well,
Yeah.
if that line, that amazing opening line appeals to you, I think in some ways that's what Station 11 does as well. It's like, let's move on past the end of the world and get to more interesting things.
That's interesting. Yeah, it sounds very interesting. I do like the idea of this more slice of life. Like, let's get more into the characterization and less about this high stakes, dramatic end of the world apocalypse thing. I think there's a lot of interesting thoughts about the human condition to explore in something like a modern day setting, fallout of a pandemic kind of situation. And you piqued my interest, I'll say that.
I'm glad to hear it, Charles. I would love to read this on the podcast at some point, but we've got this giant TBR right now. So hopefully
Oh
one day,
my
Charles.
gosh, it is giant.
That is, I mean, that's one of the great things about standalones. This is a standalone recommendation series, and I think that you can kind of just use these as palate cleansers a little bit.
You
It's
get that
only,
slice of life. You
yes,
you it changes your perspective and the way you think about certain things. It leaves some memories with you, but then you can you're not in it for 14 books.
yeah, it feels like that Wheel of Time buddy read is definitely on the forefront of our minds over here.
I am very excited to get into it, but it is fun to be talking about while facing the prospect of reading a 14-book series, to be talking about these standalones and how they affect us in different ways. And yeah, man, that's an
Yep.
interesting perspective to bring to the table. We talk so much swords and sorcery. It's nice to hear about a more modern setting story.
Yeah. Well, I was like, look, should I talk about Elantris or Warbreaker, both by Brendan Sanderson? When of course I love those
Warbreaker would have been a
books.
good pick for me. I haven't read Elantris yet, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's what's
So
good
I
about these
thought about it.
recommendation series. It
Yeah.
allows us to bring in different books and authors and perspectives that we can't get into in our buddy reads. We're committed to a certain author, a certain world for several weeks at a time. So to be able to break it up and kind of expand on this whole speculative fiction thing we're trying to achieve, I appreciate reaching out for something a little more out of the realm of what we're currently covering with our buddy reads.
True, Charles. Oh, and I did just think of other people this book might appeal to. I would say people who like theater. They are Shakespeare troupe, and I
Theater
would say,
people.
yeah, theater people, people into like acting or Hollywood even, because it's like you get an idea of this guy's life where he's this Hollywood actor, and it's not like glamorized, which I think is kind of interesting. It's kind of like what it's like to be someone who's famous, warts and all, in its portrayal of those things. So I don't know,
Hmm.
maybe people into that kind of stuff as well.
That is interesting. I am always fascinated by Hollywood and the industry and stuff. So you sold me. And
Nice.
so I will introduce my recommended standalone book. And I'll first start off by saying the author. This is an author that is welcome at the seat of the table that is best-selling fantasy authors, but we have yet to talk about on our show. And that is Guy Gavriel Kay. And no, this is not Lions of Alrasan, which I have never read. And no, it is not Tigana, which I have read and liked. This is instead one of his more perhaps understated series, and it is Under Heaven. It is his
Nailed
11th
it.
novel, thank you, and it was published in 2010. What's interesting about Guy Gavriel Kay as an author and about Under Heaven is that Under Heaven is this unique blend of historical fiction and fantasy, which you would think historical fiction is kind of fantastical, but the fact that he's able to draw a clear line between the two and then blend them together is what makes Under Heaven super interesting. Of course, this period of history we're talking about, for Under Heaven, Guy Gavriel Kay was inspired by the Tang Dynasty in China, which was hundreds of years ago. So it's very much like a swords and sorcery, but in over in China, heavily inspired by the Tang Dynasty. And Guy describes this dynasty as glittering, glorious, sophisticated, violently dangerous, and one of the absolute high points of civilization anywhere. So we've seen Guy Gavriel Kay kind of like his art of the setting is also a super fascinating one, like with Tigano, which is perhaps a standalone novel that more fantasy fans are familiar with from his work. Has this very European Mediterranean setting, and Guy does a ton of research into these historical civilizations like Rome or in this case the Tang Dynasty, and then he kind of creates his own world from that. In Under Heaven, the story opens with a weary soldier named Tai, T-A-I, who dedicates his days burying the countless bones of soldiers from a battle long forgotten. So he just wakes up, buries a body, but there's still countless bodies everywhere, and goes to bed. It's kind of like a fruitless effort, but it's one he's committed to. It's a very interesting opening scene, and it's this dedicated act of kindness that earns him the attention and admiration of a princess, who gives him this disproportionately generous gift of 250 exceptional war horses called Sardian horses. And to give you a sense of how big of a deal that is, I just took a quote from the very beginning of the book. You give a man one of the Sardian horses to reward him greatly. You give him 4 or 5 of these glories to exalt him above his fellows, propel him towards rank, and earn him the jealousy, possibly mortal, of those who rode the smaller horses of the steppes. The Princess Chang Wang, a royal consort of Targur, now through 20 years of peace, had just bestowed upon him, with permission, 250 of the dragon horses. So this absolutely preposterous gift all of a sudden puts this inconsequential soldier into this political spotlight. And while it opens the doors to meeting with kings and other political leaders, it also puts a target on his back from those who are more power hungry in politics. And so it's kind of the theme is about how these acts of generosity, or how these seemingly insignificant decisions have ripple effects in politics and society. And that's kind of the driving force of this book. So, you would read this book if you were really drawn into this historical fiction component. There's this really interesting quote from Guy Gavriel Kay on why he chooses to blend historical fiction and fantasy versus just writing historical fiction. And he goes, I prefer to offer a character inspired by great people than to pretend that I have any access to the thoughts and relationships of the real figure, or that I'm offering the reader a valid picture of an actual person and I want to chase a free ride on their celebrity. Spinning the story slightly towards an invented setting and character modeled on the real ones feels both a creatively liberating and ethically valid approach. And there's a lot you could talk about um, why fantasy is such a great vehicle for this, because like if you know the history of how society plays out, it would kind of be spoilers, but you kind of avoid that. He's also more liberated in the sense that he could write anything that happens to these characters. He can change events, he can keep the drama going, he can keep the pacing going without worrying about being true to like a specific character. And Guy Gavriel always does a really good job of that, of being committed to a setting but weaving in these elements of fantasy. And I would recommend Under Heaven because in one standalone novel, Guy Gavriel expertly reminds me of one of the many reasons why I love the fantasy genre. And I'll quote him again here. He says, "I love the way folklore and fantasy tap into the roots of storytelling. The paradox for me is that by moving a story into the fantastic, we can actually bring it closer to the reader, not move it further away." So, I mean, that's the reason you'd read Guy Gavriel is just this idea of coming back to that idea of human condition and exploring the consequences of politics and exploring what's happened in history in an honest way, but also a fictional, fantastical way. And that's my pitch for for Under Heaven.
Nice, Charles. You've definitely intrigued me. I have read Tigana, um, but I have not read anything else by Guy
Yeah.
Gavriel Kay.
And I'll say, if you've read Tigana, and like, okay, if I read Tigana and I liked it or I didn't like it, where am I coming into with Under Heaven? And I'll say Tigana has higher highs but also lower lows as a book. And Under Heaven is definitely more consistent. But I would say, in terms of like action and drama, Under Heaven is pretty understated in that respect. So if you're looking for something action packed, page turner drama, not so much. But if you're looking for like a political intrigue, like deep dive into a more exotic setting than you would typically read in fantasy, it's a solid read.
Well said, Charles. I I again find myself looking at our giant TBR and being like, is there a way that we could find somewhere to fit this in? Because I really want to read some more of what Guy Gavriel Kay has to offer.
Mm-hmm.
Tigana is quite good. I think that he's kind of the master of the standalone in some ways. I'm
Yeah.
glad that you brought him up here, because if you look at rankings on places like Our Fantasy of top standalone novels, you will see his name littered throughout.
Right. Yeah, he does a great job of like identifying something that he's really into. Like for Tigana, just this the history of the Mediterranean and the politics around it, and it really creates this really interesting setting that you normally wouldn't get. Like, we're so used to European swords and sorcery, but to get like Mediterranean, the slight differences to that he weaves in are super interesting. And the theme of Tigana is an interesting one. It's like how tyranny attempts to erase the identity of conquered peoples, which is, again, going back to why I like Guy Gavriel Kay's approach to fantasies. Like, sometimes there's more truth or relatability in the fantastic than in just purely historical fiction. He's like, I could have written a story about an Italian emperor who did these things, or I could make it about a nebulous, like a fantasy character, and that way more people can kind of identify with it. And then let's bring it into the fantastic, where this emperor literally tries to erase an identity of peoples. So it makes for a really interesting read. I'll say the themes for Under Heaven aren't as kind of realized or concrete as that. I would say the theme for Under Heaven is like the consequences of seemingly inconsequential, generous uncalculated decisions have on the world. These moments in history where it's like, wow, what if that moment played out differently? We might not have had this huge war or huge falling out or
A sort
whatever.
of butterfly effect.
Yeah, sort of. This idea of how there's also this idea of like there's emperors are kind of complacent and they create this like power vacuum, but mostly it's like, wow, what if what if that sniper missed shooting Archduke Franz Ferdinand when we have World War One? So it's kind of weird things like that. It's like, what if she didn't give those 250 horses? What if this emperor didn't do this, or what if he didn't
Yeah.
do that? It is that butterfly ripple effect and how it affects history, and that's what Under Heaven kind of gets into.
I like the idea of this person who is out of his depths, kind of unwittingly embroiled in
Yeah.
all of this really intense political intrigue, Charles.
There is, and there's also these elements of like, oh, the award has to be claimed in person, so people are like waiting to like, otherwise they would just kill them instantly and taken the horse. It's like, oh, he has to go claim them first, and then he's just like, was this really a gift, or was this just like why did you do this to me? Now I'm getting way too much unwanted attention, and yeah, he navigates these political compasses, and we know from like Chinese history that this idea of like war generals and emperors and like you get into all of it. It's super interesting. He really does an intimate research of these civilizations when he goes into writing. And I would say that about Tigana, and I'd say that about Under Heaven. And that's a really strong reason to read Guy Gavriel Kay for all those history buffs. It's like he does honestly research these civilizations and portray them in a way that's relatable to the human condition, not just to history.
Well said, Charles. The whole historical fiction bit that you dove into with that quote is really intriguing. I
Yeah.
think it makes total sense thinking about it, having read Tigana, that he basically, right, he gets inspired by these settings and these events, and then he's like, oh, I can tell this story but change in whatever ways I want to say what I want to say and
Right.
not have to worry about all the baggage that comes with that. So he's one of the masters of the genre, Charles. He's
For
a
sure.
fantasy writer's fantasy writer too. I always hear these modern or these like contemporary fantasy authors. It's amazing when I hear interviews from them how many of them cite Gabriel Kay as being such a huge influence for them, and he's been at it a long time and inspired a lot of folks to get going and writing works like his.
And I'd say rightfully so. He definitely came up with a formula for him that really gets to the root at one of the reasons fantasy is such a popular genre for so many people, myself included. He's drawing on history, but he's also trying to create these like what if moments, and by exploring it to the fantastical degree by creating these engaging dramatic worlds that you wouldn't normally be able to do with a straight up historical fiction. He's kind of liberating himself from the confines of history or having to honestly portray a certain character, and he's bringing in elements of the fantastic just to tell a really engaging thinker of a story. And that's why I think he's, and his research is insane. Like, I mean, the amount of work he goes into coming up with names of characters and places and the whole setting is, it's done through so much meticulous research. And the fact that I would expect him just write tons of books in a Mediterranean setting, but no, he does Mediterranean, he does European, he does Asian. It's like the guy must be a real history buff.
Well, an engaging thinker of a story, says Charles of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast.
That's right.
I'm
Guy
sure
can put
he's
that on the cover.
yeah, I'm sure he's desperate for a Charles quote on his book.
No, so for me, it's just fun. It's different, and it's a part of why I liked reading Poppy War too. It's just like that. I've always liked to spice up the setting a little bit. We don't get too much of an Asian influence in modern fantasy too much, so it's just nice to see. And also in the Poppy Wars case, it was like R.F. Kuang obviously does a ton of research into Chinese history as well. Hers was more modern than the Tang Dynasty, but it was still like just, I would say that is maybe a bit more into the fantasy, but she does draw on historical moments to create that world. And in both, I think anyone that liked Poppy War would have an interest in Under Heaven. It's certainly not as exciting as Poppy War, but it is
Few books are
reminiscing of the same elements and themes of the setting. So,
well, I'm gonna step a bit out of my bounds and trying to give recommendations to people who might like this book, even though I haven't read the book, by saying that folks who've liked the Goblin Emperor maybe would enjoy this. I don't know if you know about that one by Catherine Addison. It's about it's a half goblin individual who is like way down the line of a succession, who ends up, because of this accident, being put in charge of an empire, and he's involved in all of this political intrigue that he's woefully unprepared to be involved in. So if that fish out of water element of being involved in political intrigue appeals to you, then maybe this is for you.
Perhaps there is political navigation here. And without having read that, I can't give it my full endorsement, but I will say that if you do like kind of that fish out of water, high stakes politics aspect, that is definitely found in Under Heaven for sure.
Cool. All right.
And that's our recommendations.
This is the Station 11 and Under Heaven recommendation series.
That's
11th Heaven,
right. You're looking,
as they say.
11th Heaven. If you're looking for a break in a series and just pick up a little standalone, a nice thinker, check out one of these books.
Nice thinker.
Yeah, a nice thinker. They have our recommendation.
Our high school English teacher, I think, once referred to Charles as a nice thinker.
I don't even know if that was even the case, but I'll take it. But yeah, I mean, unless we have more to say about our recommended standalone novels, I'm ready to play that outro music.
I think we've said it all, Charles.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. If you like what you heard today, toss 5 stars to our podcast on Apple Podcasts. You can also just kind of follow us or subscribe to us wherever you listen to your podcasts. To find us on social media, check out the FTF podcast with the number 1 at the end for Twitter. Dylan does a great job over there on Twitter. We're also on Instagram and Facebook at the FTF podcast. You can shoot us an email at theftfpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know if you've read these books, if you liked them, if you're thinking about giving them a try. We want to know, so please reach out. To find out our reading schedule, see what else we've got cooking, check out our website, theftfpodcast.com. And yeah, that's about it. Just Google us, interact with us, show us some love. Appreciate you listening. If you give any of these books a chance, that would be wild. Let us know what you thought. We'd love to hear it. And yeah,
Nailed it.
I think we did. So thank you everyone for listening, and as always, go forth and conquer, friends.